Welcome back to another long journey through the quieter corners of history. Tonight, we're going to explore something that has shaped countless lives across centuries and continents. The choice, or sometimes the burden, of celibacy. Before we settle in together, if you enjoy what we do here, feel free to give this video a like and subscribe to join our community of fellow night wanderers. I'm always curious to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment and let me know which corner of the world you're calling home as we drift back through time together. Now, dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and let's step gently into a world where the absence of touch could mean everything: power, devotion, survival, or simply the quiet ache of what might have been. Celibacy. The word itself sits heavy on the tongue, doesn't it? Neither harsh nor soft, but somehow weighted with all the complexity of human desire, deliberately set aside. Tonight, we'll walk through monastery halls where sunrise prayers echo off cold stone walls, through the scholarly chambers of ancient Alexandria, where brilliant minds chose solitude over companionship, and into the perfumed courts of empires, where celibacy was not always a choice, but sometimes the very foundation of power itself. This is not a story of dramatic renunciation or passionate struggle. Instead, it's the quieter tale of how ordinary people monks rising before dawn, scholars bent over manuscripts, servants navigating palace corridors lived with the daily reality of lives deliberately constrained. How they found meaning, purpose, and sometimes profound loneliness in spaces between what they wanted and what they had chosen, or what had been chosen for them. Let's begin in the most unlikely place, not with grand gestures of renunciation, but with the simple, repetitive rhythm of a day that has been lived the same way for centuries. In a monastery, where the bells mark not just the hours, but the steady passage of a life lived in service to something greater than earthly desire. Verse 1. A Benedictine monk's day. The first bell rings while the world still sleeps in darkness. It's called matins, though the monks who rise to its call have long since stopped thinking of it as a mere name. Brother Thomas, let's call him Thomas, though his name before God might have been different stirs on his straw mattress in the dormitory. The stone walls hold the cold of an October night in 1247, somewhere in the rolling hills of what we now call France, though he thinks of it simply as home. The dormitory is a long, narrow chamber where 23 brothers sleep in ordered rows. Each has a simple wooden bed, a straw mattress, and a single woolen blanket. There are no partitions, no privacy, no space for the mind to wander into solitary thoughts. This is intentional. The rule of Saint Benedict, written 7 centuries before Thomas was born, understood something about human nature that modern psychology would later codify. Isolation breeds obsession, but community can be its own form of discipline. Thomas rises with the others in the darkness. No one speaks. The silence is not uncomfortable. It has the weight of ritual, of something chosen rather than imposed. He pulls his woolen tunic over his head, feeling the familiar scratch of rough cloth against skin that has grown thin from years of simple food and hard work. The tunic is brown, the color of earth, of humility. It falls to his knees, and over it he draws his scapular, a sleeveless garment that marks him as a monk of Saint Benedict. His feet find the cold stone floor, and he follows the line of his brothers through the dormitory door and down the narrow stairs to the church. The stairs are worn smooth by decades of feet making this same journey, day after day, year after year. Thomas's feet know every dip and rise of the stone, every place where the steps have been worn into shallow cups by the passage of the faithful. The church is vast and cold, lit only by a handful of candles and the pale light of stars filtering through narrow windows. The brothers take their places in the choir stalls, carved wooden seats that face each other across the nave. Thomas has sat in the same stall for 8 years now, since he took his final vows at 25. He knows the wood grain of the armrest, the way the seat curves to accommodate a body that has grown thinner with each passing year of monastic life. The chanting begins. The psalms rise and fall in the ancient melodies of Gregorian chant, voices weaving together in harmonies that seem to lift the very stones of the church. Thomas's voice joins the others, his bass note finding its place in the complex tapestry of sound. The Latin words are as familiar to him as his own breath. Dies in adjutorium meum intend. O God, come to my assistance. But tonight, as the familiar words shape themselves in his mouth, Thomas finds his mind wandering. It's a small rebellion, this drift of attention, but one that comes more frequently now that he has reached his 33rd year. He thinks of his hands, pressed together in prayer, and remembers unbidden the last time he touched another human being with tenderness. It was his mother, when he left home to join the monastery. She had cupped his face in her hands, her calloused palms warm against his cheeks, and whispered a blessing in the local dialect that the monks would have him forget in favor of Latin. The memory is sharp and unwelcome. Thomas draws his attention back to the chant, but the damage is done. His body, trained in celibacy for 8 years, responds to the memory with a familiar stirring that he must now consciously suppress. This is the quiet hardship that no one speaks of, not the grand renunciation of marriage or family, but the small daily moments when the body remembers what the mind has chosen to forget. The service continues. Matins is the longest of the day's 8 prayer services, lasting nearly an hour. Thomas stands and sits and kneels with the rhythm of the liturgy, his body moving through the familiar motions, while his mind works to regain its proper focus. He concentrates on the words, on their meaning, on the way they connect him to centuries of believers who have spoken these same phrases in the darkness before dawn. When Matins ends, the brothers file out of the church in the same silence that brought them in. Dawn is still hours away, but there is work to be done. Thomas makes his way to the scriptorium, where he serves as a copyist. The work is painstaking and precise, copying sacred texts by hand, letter by letter, word by word. In an age before printing, this is how knowledge spreads, how the wisdom of the ancients is preserved for future generations. The scriptorium is a large room with high windows that will later admit the morning light. For now, Thomas works by candlelight, his quill pen scratching softly across parchment. He is copying a text of St. Augustine's Confessions, and the irony is not lost on him. Augustine wrote extensively about the struggle with desire, about the difficulty of choosing the spiritual over the physical. Grant me chastity and continence, Augustine had prayed, but not yet. Thomas pauses in his copying. His hand, skilled from years of practice, has formed the letters without conscious thought, but now he reads the words he has written. The body corrupts the soul, and the soul struggles against the flesh. He thinks of his own struggles, his own moments of weakness, when the celibate life feels less like a choice and more like a burden. But there is something else in Augustine's words, something that Thomas has learned to recognize over the years. The struggle itself has value. The daily choice to turn away from physical desire, to channel that energy into spiritual pursuit, has carved something in him that he would not trade away. It has given him a sensitivity to beauty that he might never have developed otherwise. The way morning light falls across the altar, the mathematical precision of the chant, the feel of well-made parchment beneath his fingers. The dawn bell rings prime, the first official hour of the monastic day. Thomas sets down his quill and joins the procession back to the church. The service is shorter this time, and when it ends, the brothers move to the refectory for their first meal of the day. It is a simple meal bread, weak ale, perhaps a piece of cheese. They eat in silence, while one of the brothers reads aloud from a spiritual text. Thomas chews slowly, methodically. The bread is coarse, made from barley and oats with only a little wheat. It has the honest taste of grain and labor, nothing like the fine white bread he remembers from his childhood home. His family had not been wealthy, but they had been prosperous enough to afford wheat bread on feast days. The memory brings with it a sudden, sharp longing, not for the bread itself, but for the warmth of family gathered around a table, for the easy intimacy of shared meals and casual conversation. This, too, is part of the sacrifice. Not just the absence of romantic love, but the absence of all the small intimacies that make life warm and connected. Thomas has brothers here, yes, but their relationships are bounded by rules and roles. They do not share stories of their past lives, do not speak of their families, do not develop the kind of deep friendships that might distract from their spiritual purpose. After the meal, Thomas returns to his copying. The morning light now streams through the scriptorium windows, and he can work without the strain of candlelight. His quill moves steadily across the parchment, forming letters that will outlast his own life by centuries. There is something profound in this work, something that connects him to the larger flow of human knowledge and devotion. But as the morning progresses, Thomas finds himself distracted again. It is washing day in the monastery, and through the window, he can see the lay brothers working in the courtyard, scrubbing the community's robes and linens in large wooden tubs. One of the brothers, a young man named Peter, who joined the community only last year, has rolled up his sleeves and is working with particular energy, his forearms strong and brown from outdoor labor. Thomas watches for a moment longer than he should. Peter is perhaps 22, with the easy grace of youth and the bright eyes of someone who has not yet been worn down by the accumulated weight of years of celibacy. There is something in the way he moves, something in the unconscious vitality of his body, that stirs in Thomas a complex mixture of longing and loss. It is not desire, exactly, or not desire alone. It is something more complicated, more layered. It is the recognition of his own youth, now passing, and the acknowledgement of roads not taken. It is the sudden, sharp awareness of what he has given up in choosing this life, and the equally sharp awareness that he would choose it again, given the chance. Thomas forces himself to return to his work. Augustine's words flow from his quill. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. The words are a comfort and a challenge. They acknowledge the restlessness, the longing, the sense of incompleteness that even the most devoted monk must sometimes feel. But they also promise that this restlessness serves a purpose, and it points towards something greater than earthly satisfaction. The morning passes in this rhythm of work and distraction, of spiritual focus and human longing. Thomas copies page after page, his hand moving with practiced skill, while his mind wrestles with the eternal questions of the celibate life. Is this struggle a failing, or is it simply the human condition? Is the monk who never feels desire more holy than the one who feels it, but chooses to turn away? The bell rings for terce, the third hour, and Thomas sets down his quill once more. The cycle begins again. Prayer, work, each element supporting the others in a rhythm that has sustained monasteries for centuries. As he files into the church with his brothers, Thomas reflects on the strange mathematics of monastic life. They have given up the possibility of earthly family in order to become brothers to each other. They have renounced physical intimacy in order to develop a different kind of intimacy with the divine. It is a trade-off that some days feels like wisdom and other days feels like loss. Today, as Thomas kneels in the familiar coolness of the church and adds his voice to the ancient chant, it feels like both. The longing is still there, will always be there, but so is the peace that comes from choosing something difficult and sustaining it day after day, year after year. The chant rises around him, voices joining in harmonies that have been sung for centuries. Thomas closes his eyes and lets the music carry him, lets it wash over the small rebellions of his body and the larger questions of his heart. This is his life, chosen and sustained through countless small acts of will. It is not the life he might have imagined as a young man, but it is the life he has made, and in the making of it, he has discovered depths of himself that he might never have known otherwise. The service ends, and the brothers file out in their customary silence. Thomas returns to his copying, to the slow, careful work of preserving the wisdom of the ages. His quill moves across the parchment with steady precision, forming words that will outlast his own struggles and uncertainties. In the quiet of the scriptorium, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the accumulated wisdom of centuries, Thomas finds a kind of peace that is not the absence of longing, but the presence of something greater. This is the first lesson of celibacy, not that desire disappears, but that it can be transformed into something else. Something that serves not just the individual, but the larger community of faith and learning. Something that connects the small, private struggles of one man to the vast, ongoing conversation between humanity and the divine. Verse 2. Hypatia of Alexandria. Intellectual chastity as shield and doom. The Mediterranean sun filters through the tall windows of the great library of Alexandria, casting long shadows across scrolls and tablets that contain the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. It is the year 400 CE, and the city that was once the jewel of learning in the Roman Empire still maintains its reputation as a center of scholarship, though the political winds are shifting in ways that will soon prove dangerous for those who live by the light of reason alone. In this world of parchment and debate, of geometric proofs and astronomical calculations, moves a figure who has become legendary, not just for her brilliance, but for her deliberate choice to remain unmarried, untouched, devoted entirely to the pursuit of knowledge. Her name is Hypatia, and she is perhaps the most famous woman mathematician and philosopher of the ancient world. Hypatia is the daughter of Theon, himself a distinguished mathematician and astronomer, but she has far surpassed her father's reputation, becoming the most sought-after teacher in Alexandria. Students travel from across the Mediterranean to attend her lectures on mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. They come not just for her knowledge, but for the clarity of her mind, the precision of her reasoning, and the way she can make the most complex mathematical concepts seem as natural as the movement of the stars. She is, by all accounts, a woman of extraordinary beauty. Ancient sources describe her as tall and graceful, with the kind of presence that commands attention the moment she enters a room. Her beauty is not just physical. There is something in her bearing, in the way she moves through the world with complete confidence in her own intellect, that draws people to her like moths to flame. But Hypatia has made a choice that sets her apart from virtually every other woman of her time and social class. She has chosen celibacy, not as a religious vow, but as a practical necessity for the life she wants to lead. In the ancient world, marriage for a woman of her station would mean the end of her intellectual pursuits. A married woman belongs to her husband, her time and energy devoted to his needs and the raising of his children. For Hypatia, this would mean the death of everything that makes her who she is. Her celibacy is not the quiet, contemplative celibacy of the monk. It is bold, public, almost defiant. She moves through the world as a woman who belongs to no man, who answers to no authority, but her own intellect and the pursuit of truth. This is revolutionary in a way that we can barely comprehend today. In ancient Alexandria, a woman's sexuality is not her own. It belongs to her father until marriage, then to her husband. But Hypatia has claimed ownership of her own body, her own desires, her own choices. The stories about her are telling. When one of her students, a young man named Orestes, who will later become prefect of Alexandria, declares his love for her and asks for her hand in marriage, Hypatia's response is both shocking and elegant. Rather than simply refusing him, she demonstrates her commitment to her chosen path in a way that is both symbolic and visceral. She lifts her robes and shows him her menstrual cloth, saying, "This is what you desire, young man, not beauty itself." The gesture is crude by the standards of her time, but it is also profound. She is showing him that what he thinks he desires, her beauty, her person, her body, is in fact nothing more than flesh and blood, subject to the same biological processes as any other woman. The true Hypatia, the one worth desiring, is her mind, her knowledge, her ability to unlock the secrets of the universe. And that Hypatia cannot be possessed by any man. This is the first way in which celibacy serves as her shield. It protects her from the conventional expectations of womanhood, allows her to carve out a space in the world where she can be valued for her intellect rather than her fertility. In a society where women are defined by their relationships to men, Hypatia defines herself by her relationship to knowledge. But there is another, more subtle way in which celibacy serves her. The students who flock to her lectures, who hang on her every word, who travel hundreds of miles to study under her. Many of them are young men, and many of them are attracted to her not just intellectually, but physically. Her beauty is part of her power, part of what draws them to her. But her celibacy transforms that attraction into something else. Because she is unattainable, because she belongs to no one, she becomes a kind of ideal figure part teacher, part muse, part goddess. Her students can worship her without the messy complications of actual relationship. They can project onto her their ideals of feminine wisdom and beauty without having to confront the reality of her as a flesh and blood woman with her own needs and desires. In this way, her celibacy becomes a kind of performance, a role she plays that allows her to maintain her authority and influence. She is the virgin philosopher, the untouchable teacher, the woman who has transcended the limitations of the flesh in service of the mind. It is a powerful position, but it is also a lonely one. For Hypatia does have desires, does feel the pull of human connection. There are hints of this in the few personal details that survive about her life. She forms close friendships with some of her students, relationships that seem to go beyond the merely intellectual. She corresponds with philosophers across the Mediterranean, and her letters reveal a warmth and humor that suggest a woman who values human connection, even as she has chosen to limit it. But perhaps most tellingly, she never stops teaching. Her lectures become more than just academic exercises. They become a form of intimacy, a way of sharing her deepest thoughts and insights with others. Through teaching, she creates a kind of intellectual family, a community of minds that provides some of the connection and meaning that she has foregone in choosing celibacy. The irony is that the very thing that protects her reputation for chastity, her position as the untouchable wise woman, also makes her vulnerable in ways she cannot foresee. As the political climate in Alexandria shifts, as Christian influence grows stronger and more militant, Hypatia's independence begins to seem less like wisdom and more like a threat. The Christian leaders of Alexandria see in her something dangerous, a woman who claims authority over her own body and mind, who teaches ideas that challenge religious orthodoxy, who represents a way of thinking that values reason over faith. Her celibacy, which she has chosen as a form of freedom, begins to be seen as a form of defiance. The most dangerous aspect of her position is her relationship with Orestes, the former student who has become prefect of Alexandria. Although she refused his romantic advances years earlier, they have remained close friends and intellectual companions. Orestes consults her on matters of philosophy and governance, and she serves as one of his most trusted advisors. Their relationship is entirely proper by the standards of the time. She is his teacher. He is her former student, and there is no suggestion of romantic or sexual involvement. But to Cyril, the powerful Archbishop of Alexandria, this relationship represents something threatening. Here is a woman who has influence over the most powerful secular authority in the city, a woman who teaches ideas that challenge Christian doctrine, a woman who represents the old pagan ways of thinking. And she is unmarried, uncontrolled, accountable to no man. The tension builds slowly. Cyril begins to preach against the dangers of pagan philosophy, against the seductive power of worldly wisdom. He speaks of the need for Christian women to be modest, submissive, devoted to their husbands and families. He never mentions Hypatia by name, but everyone understands who he means. Hypatia, for her part, continues to teach, continues to move through the world with the same confidence and independence she has always shown. She does not seem to fully understand the danger she is in, or perhaps she understands it, but refuses to be intimidated. She has lived her entire adult life as a woman who belongs to no one, and she will not change that now. The end, when it comes, is swift and terrible. On a day in March of 415 CE, as Hypatia is returning from one of her lectures, she is attacked by a mob of Christian zealots. They drag her from her chariot, strip her naked, and kill her in the most brutal way imaginable. Her body is dismembered, her flesh scraped from her bones with pottery shards, her remains burned. The violence is shocking, but it is also symbolic. The mob does not just kill her, they violate her, strip away the dignity and autonomy she has spent her life maintaining. They reduce her to flesh, to the very physicality she has spent her life transcending. In death, she is forcibly possessed in a way she never allowed herself to be possessed in life. The historical record is clear about the political motivations for her murder. She was killed because of her influence, because of her association with Orestes, because she represented a threat to Christian authority. But there is something else at work here, something that goes deeper than politics or religion. Hypatia was killed, at least in part, because she was a woman who had claimed ownership of her own body and mind. Her celibacy, which she had chosen as a form of freedom, had become in the eyes of her enemies a form of defiance that could not be tolerated. She had lived as though she belonged to no one, and for that presumption she was destroyed. The tragedy of Hypatia is not just that she died young, not just that her brilliance was lost to the world. The tragedy is that the very thing that had protected her, her reputation for chastity, her position as the untouchable wise woman, ultimately made her a target. She had tried to use celibacy as a shield, but in the end, it became a sword pointed at her heart. In the years after her death, Hypatia becomes a symbol for some, a martyr to reason and free thought. For others, a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and defiance. But perhaps the most accurate way to understand her is as a woman who tried to carve out a space for herself in a world that had no category for what she wanted to be. She wanted to be a scholar, a teacher, a seeker of truth. She wanted to belong to herself, to be valued for her mind rather than her body. She chose celibacy not as a religious discipline, but as a practical necessity, a way of maintaining her independence and authority in a world that would have otherwise reduced her to someone's wife or daughter. For most of her life, this strategy worked. She became one of the most respected intellectuals of her time, a teacher whose influence extended across the Mediterranean. But in the end, the very independence that had made her great also made her vulnerable. She had lived as though she could transcend the limitations that society placed on women, and for that presumption, she paid the ultimate price. The story of Hypatia reminds us that celibacy is never just about individual choice or personal discipline. It is always also about power. Who has it, who wants it, and how far they will go to maintain it. Hypatia's celibacy was a claim to power, a declaration that she would not be controlled or possessed by any man. It was a bold and necessary choice, but it was also a dangerous one. In the end, her story is both inspiring and tragic. She shows us what is possible when a brilliant mind is allowed to flourish, when a woman claims authority over her own life and body. But she also shows us the price that such choices can exact, the way that society will sometimes destroy what it cannot control. As the sun sets over Alexandria, casting long shadows across the ruins of the great library, we can still hear the echo of her voice, still feel the presence of her mind grappling with the eternal questions of mathematics and philosophy. She is gone, but her legacy remains a reminder that the choice to remain celibate, to devote oneself entirely to the pursuit of knowledge, can be both the greatest freedom and the most dangerous form of defiance. Verse 3. Buddhist vows of celibacy and essential metaphors of spiritual training. The morning mist clings to the mountains of ancient India, somewhere in the 3rd century BCE. In the years following the Buddha's death, when his teachings are still being shaped and refined by those who knew him or knew those who knew him. In a monastery carved into the living rock of a hillside, a young monk named Ananda, not the famous disciple of the Buddha, but one of thousands who would carry that name in honor of the beloved, companion sits in meditation as the first light of dawn filters through the narrow windows. Ananda has been a monk for 3 years now, since he was 18, and he is struggling with something that his teachers have warned him about, but which he was not prepared to experience so intensely. The Buddha called it tanha, thirst, craving, the endless hunger that drives all human suffering. For Ananda, this thirst manifests most powerfully in the form of sexual desire, a constant undercurrent that threatens to pull his mind away from the path of enlightenment. His teacher, an elderly monk named Kassapa, has been working with him on this problem, and the methods they use are both beautiful and strange. Rather than simply suppressing desire or declaring it evil, the Buddhist approach is more subtle, more psychological. It involves a kind of mental alchemy that transforms the very energy of desire into something else entirely. This morning, as Ananda sits in the half-light of dawn, Kassapa begins one of their regular sessions. But instead of speaking directly about celibacy or sexual renunciation, he begins to tell a story that seems, on the surface, to be about something else entirely. Imagine, Kassapa says, his voice soft and measured, that you are walking through a garden in the heat of summer. You are desperately thirsty, and you come upon a well. The water in the well is cool and clear, and you can see your reflection in its depths. You long to drink, but as you lower the bucket, you notice something strange. The water, though it appears clear, has a thin film of oil on its surface. Not much, just enough to catch the light and shimmer with rainbow colors. Ananda listens, his mind immediately engaged by the image. He can feel the thirst, can imagine the disappointment of discovering that the water is not as pure as it appeared. Now, Kassapa continues, what do? Do you drink the water anyway, accepting that it will taste of oil and perhaps make you sick? Do you turn away and continue to suffer from thirst? Or do you find a way to remove the oil and drink the pure water beneath? The question hangs in the air between them. Ananda knows that this is not really about water and oil, but about desire and the mind. The Buddhist teachings are full of such metaphors, images that work on multiple levels simultaneously. The thirst is literal thirst, but it is also tanha, the craving that drives all suffering. The oil on the water is the distortion that desire creates, the way it makes us see things not as they are, but as we want them to be. I would find a way to remove the oil, Ananda says finally. Kassapa nods. And how would you do that? Ananda thinks. He has lived in rural communities all his life, has seen people deal with practical problems like contaminated water. I might use a cloth to absorb the oil, or wait for it to separate naturally, or perhaps use a leaf to skim it away. Exactly, Kassapa says. You would not curse the water for being impure, nor would you curse yourself for being thirsty. You would simply apply the right technique to separate what you need from what you don't need. This is the beginning of Ananda's real education in the Buddhist approach to celibacy. Over the weeks and months that follow, Kassapa will teach him a series of meditative techniques that use sensual imagery not to suppress desire, but to transform it. One of the most powerful of these techniques is called acebobai meditation, meditation on the unbeautiful. But the way Kassapa teaches, it is not crude or demeaning. Instead, it is a kind of gentle dissection of the process of attraction itself. When you see a beautiful woman, Kassapa explains, what exactly are you seeing? Are you seeing her as she is? Or are you seeing your own projections, your own desires reflected back at you? He teaches Ananda to break down the experience of attraction into its component parts. The curve of a neck, the movement of hair in the wind, the sound of laughter, each element is examined separately, not to destroy its beauty, but to understand how the mind constructs the experience of desire. The neck, Kassapa says, is simply flesh stretched over bone and sinew. The hair is dead protein, no different from the hair of any animal. The laughter is vibration of air, produced by the movement of tongue and throat. None of these things in themselves possess the power to create desire. That power comes from the mind, from the stories we tell ourselves about what we see. This is not meant to be cynical or reductive. Instead, it is a kind of gentle scientific observation, a way of understanding the mechanics of attraction without being overwhelmed by them. Ananda learns to see the difference between the object of desire and the desire itself, between the person who attracts him and the mental processes that create attraction. But the most profound technique that Kassapa teaches him involves a complete reversal of the usual approach to sexual imagery. Instead of avoiding sensual thoughts, Ananda is taught to engage with them directly, but in a specific way. Imagine, Kassapa says, that you are making love to the most beautiful woman you can conceive of. Hold nothing back, let the fantasy be as vivid and as detailed as possible. Ananda is startled. This seems to go against everything he has been taught about monastic discipline. But he trusts his teacher, and he allows his mind to construct the fantasy. Now, Kassapa says, stay with the fantasy, but begin to ask yourself, who is experiencing this pleasure? Where exactly is the pleasure located? Is it in the body, in the mind, or somewhere else entirely? As Ananda follows these instructions, something strange happens. The more closely he examines the experience of fantasy, the more elusive it becomes. He cannot pin down exactly where the pleasure is supposed to be happening, cannot identify the self that is supposedly experiencing it. The fantasy, which seemed so solid and compelling a moment before, begins to dissolve under close observation. This is the Buddha's insight, Kassapa explains. Desire is not eliminated by suppression, but by understanding. When you truly examine the nature of sexual fantasy, you discover that there is no solid self to experience it, no permanent object to be desired. Everything is process, everything is change, everything is empty of the permanent essence that we imagine it to have. This technique, which might seem like a form of sophisticated self-deception, is actually based on a profound understanding of the nature of consciousness. By examining desire closely, by neither suppressing it nor indulging it, the mind begins to see through the illusion of permanence and solidity that makes desire so compelling. But perhaps the most beautiful aspect of the Buddhist approach to celibacy is the way it transforms the energy of desire rather than simply blocking it. Ananda learns techniques for redirecting sexual energy into spiritual practice, for using the very force of attraction as a kind of fuel for meditation. One of these techniques involves visualization practices that are explicitly sensual in their imagery. Ananda is taught to imagine himself as a deity in union with a female consort, but the union is understood not as sexual intercourse, but as the merging of wisdom and compassion, of emptiness and bliss. The imagery is erotic, but the meaning is spiritual. The body of the goddess, Kassapa explains, represents the wisdom that sees through the illusion of solid existence. Your body represents the compassion that arises from that wisdom. When they unite, what is born is not physical pleasure, but the direct experience of enlightenment. This is a radically different approach from the Christian monasticism that we explored earlier. Where Brother Thomas struggled to suppress his desires, Ananda is learning to transform them. Where the Christian tradition sees the body as a potential source of sin, the Buddhist tradition sees it as a tool for awakening. But this transformation is not easy, and it is not without its own form of suffering. Ananda discovers that the process of closely examining desire can be intensely uncomfortable. When you really look at sexual fantasy, when you try to find the solid self that is supposed to be experiencing it, you encounter a kind of existential vertigo. The self that you have always taken for granted begins to seem less solid, less permanent than you imagined. There are nights when Ananda sits in meditation and feels as though he is dissolving, as though the boundaries between self and not self are breaking down in ways that are both liberating and terrifying. This is what the Buddhist texts call the dark night of the soul, though they use different language to describe it. This is normal, Kassapa reassures him. The mind resists the dissolution of its cherished illusions. It will create all kinds of experiences, fear, confusion, even hallucinations, to try to maintain the illusion of solid selfhood. But if you persist, if you continue to observe without being carried away by the experiences, you will eventually break through to the other side. The other side, when Ananda finally reaches it, is not what he expected. He had imagined that successful celibacy would mean the complete absence of sexual desire, a kind of pure spiritual state, free from the messiness of bodily attraction. But what he actually discovers is something more subtle and more profound. Desire is still there, but it no longer has the same grip on his mind. He can observe the arising of sexual thoughts without being overwhelmed by them, can appreciate beauty without being driven to possess it. It is as though he has learned to see through the illusion that made desire so compelling, while still being able to appreciate the beauty that originally triggered it. This is the Buddhist ideal of celibacy, not the suppression of desire, but its transformation. The energy that once drove him towards sexual gratification is now channeled into spiritual practice, into the cultivation of wisdom and compassion. The beauty that once seemed to exist outside himself is now understood to be a reflection of his own Buddha nature. But perhaps most importantly, Ananda has learned to see through the illusion of separation that makes desire so painful. The beautiful woman he might have desired is not separate from him. She is part of the same interdependent web of existence that includes everything else. The love he might have directed toward one person is now expanded to include all beings. This is not to say that his celibacy is easy or that he never struggles with desire, but the struggle has a different quality now. It is not the desperate battle against overwhelming force that characterized his early years as a monk. Instead, it is more like the gentle, persistent work of a gardener who understands that weeds will continue to grow, but who also knows how to tend them without being overwhelmed by them. Years later, when Ananda has become a teacher himself, he will pass on these techniques to his own students. But he will also understand something that his own teacher understood, that the techniques are not the point. The point is the understanding that comes from practicing them, the gradual recognition that the self that seems so solid and permanent is actually a process, a stream of consciousness that is constantly changing. The Buddhist approach to celibacy is ultimately not about renouncing sexuality, but about understanding the nature of desire itself. It is about seeing through the illusion of separation that makes us believe we need to possess what we love, about recognizing that the beauty we seek outside ourselves is actually a reflection of our own deepest nature. In the end, Ananda's celibacy becomes not a burden to be carried, but a doorway to be walked through. It is a way of transforming the most basic human drives into tools for awakening, of using the very energy that might have bound him to suffering as a means of liberation. The monastery where he practices is quiet now, the morning mist having burned away in the heat of the day. But in the silence, something profound has been accomplished. The thirst that drove him to seek satisfaction in external things has been transformed into the recognition that what he was seeking was always already present within him. The desire that once seemed like an enemy has become an ally, a force that propels him not toward possession, but toward the profound understanding that possession itself is an illusion. This is the mystery of Buddhist celibacy, not the denial of human nature, but its ultimate fulfillment through the recognition that what we truly desire is not any particular object, but the end of the illusion of separation itself. In learning to be celibate, Ananda has learned to love more deeply than he ever imagined possible, to touch the profound interconnectedness that underlies all existence. Verse 4. A eunuch's complicated thoughts on celibate priests. The afternoon call to prayer echoes across the domes and minarets of Istanbul. and in the innermost chambers of the Topkapi Palace, a man sits at a low writing desk, his reed pen moving carefully across a sheet of fine paper. The year is 1572, during the reign of Sultan Selim II, and the man writing is known in the palace records simply as Hasan Aga, though his birth name, the one given to him in a village in Georgia before he was taken as a child and brought to serve in the Ottoman court, has been lost to history. Hasan is what the Ottomans call a white eunuch, one of the castrated men who serve in the palace administration rather than in the harem. He is now 53 years old and has spent more than 4 decades in the service of the Sultan. His position is one of considerable power. He oversees the palace treasury and has the ear of the Grand Vizier himself. But today, he is writing not about matters of state, but about something more personal, more complicated. The document he is composing is a response to a letter from his nephew, a young man named Mehmet, who has recently converted to Christianity and is considering joining a monastery. The letter that prompted this response has been troubling Hasan for weeks. In it, Mehmet writes about his desire to serve God through celibacy, to renounce the pleasures of the flesh in favor of spiritual purity. He asks for his uncle's blessing and perhaps his understanding. But Hasan finds himself unable to give a simple answer. His own relationship with celibacy is complicated in ways that his nephew cannot possibly understand. Hasan's celibacy was not chosen. It was imposed upon him through castration when he was 8 years old, before he had any understanding of what was being taken from him. Yet over the decades, he has developed a complex philosophy about the nature of desire, power, and spiritual development that puts him in a unique position to understand what his nephew is contemplating. As he writes, Hasan's thoughts drift back to his own childhood, to the moment when his life was irrevocably changed. He was born in a small village in what is now Georgia, the son of a farmer who could barely feed his family. When the Ottoman tax collectors came demanding the devshirm, the tribute of Christian boys, who would be taken to serve in the Sultan's army or administration, Hasan's father made a decision that would haunt both of them for the rest of their lives. "Take him," his father had said, pointing to 8-year-old Hasan. "He is clever, and he will have a better life in the Sultan's service than he would have here." The journey to Istanbul was long and traumatic, but it was nothing compared to what awaited him. Some of the boys taken in the devshirm were trained as janissaries, the elite soldiers of the Ottoman army. Others were selected for palace service, and a few, those judged to be particularly intelligent or beautiful, were chosen for castration and training as eunuchs. Hasan still remembers the day it happened, though he tries not to. He was held down by 4 men, while a 5th performed the operation with a sharp knife and a red-hot iron. The pain was indescribable, and for several days afterward, he was delirious with fever. The palace doctors were skilled, and the mortality rate for such operations was lower than it might have been elsewhere, but still, many boys died. Hasan survived, but something essential had been taken from him, not just his manhood, but his future as a complete human being. Yet as he grew older and began to understand his position in the palace hierarchy, Hasan came to realize that his castration had given him certain advantages as well. Eunuchs were trusted in ways that intact men were not. They could move freely through the palace, could serve in positions of great responsibility, could accumulate wealth and power. They were, in a sense, freed from the complications of sexual desire and family obligation that constrained other men. This freedom, however, came at a terrible cost. Hasan had never known sexual desire in the way that normal men did. The operation had been performed before puberty, before his body had developed the capacity for such feelings. But he had always been aware of what he was missing, always conscious of the conversations and experiences that were close to him. Over the years, he had watched the intact men of the palace, the soldiers, the administrators, the servants, and observed how desire shaped their lives. He had seen how it could drive them to great achievements and terrible mistakes, how it could be both a source of energy and a cause of suffering. and he had often wondered what his own life might have been like if he had been allowed to develop naturally, to experience the full range of human desires and satisfactions. But he had also seen something else, something that his nephew's letter has brought back to mind. In his various diplomatic missions, Hazen had encountered Christian priests and monks, men who had chosen celibacy as a spiritual discipline, and he had been struck by both the similarities and the differences between their situation and his own. Like him, these men had renounced sexuality. Like him, they had devoted their lives to service, though they served God rather than a sultan. Like him, they had achieved a kind of freedom from the complications of family and romantic entanglement. But unlike him, they had made their choice freely, as adults, with full knowledge of what they were giving up. This difference has always fascinated Hazen. He has often wondered whether chosen celibacy is fundamentally different from imposed celibacy, whether the monks and priests experience their renunciation differently because it comes from their own will rather than from external force. In his letter to his nephew, Hazen tries to articulate these thoughts. "My dear Mehmet," he writes, "you ask for my blessing on your decision to join the monastery, and you ask whether I understand your desire to renounce the pleasures of the flesh. I must tell you that my understanding is both deeper and more limited than you might expect. I have lived for more than 40 years without sexual desire, without the capacity for physical love, without the possibility of marriage or children. In this, I am like the monks you wish to join, but the circumstances of my celibacy are different from theirs, and this difference has shaped my understanding in ways that may be useful to you. I did not choose my celibacy, it was chosen for me, imposed upon me before I was old enough to understand what was being taken. This has given me a perspective that I think few others possess. I have been able to observe the effects of sexual desire on others without being subject to those effects myself. I have been able to see how desire shapes men's lives, how it drives them to both greatness and folly, without being driven by it myself. What I have learned from this observation is that desire is both more powerful and more illusory than most people realize. It is powerful because it can drive men to extraordinary efforts, can inspire them to create beauty, to take risks, to sacrifice comfort and safety for the sake of love. But it is illusory because the satisfaction it promises is always temporary, always incomplete. The man who achieves the object of his desire soon discovers that his desire has shifted to something else, that the fulfillment he sought was not what he expected. This is what I think the Christian monks understand, and what you are beginning to understand. They choose celibacy not because they despise sexuality, but because they have seen through the illusion that sexual satisfaction can provide lasting happiness. They have chosen to direct their energy towards something they believe to be more permanent, more reliable. But here is where my experience differs from theirs, and where I think you should be careful. They have made their choice freely, as adults, with full knowledge of what they are giving up. They have experienced desire, have perhaps even experienced its satisfaction, and have chosen to renounce it. This gives their renunciation a different quality than mine. I have never experienced sexual desire in the way that normal men do. I have never known the urgency of physical need, the joy of physical satisfaction, the pain of sexual frustration. My celibacy is not a discipline that I maintain through constant effort. It is simply a condition of my existence, no more chosen than the color of my eyes or the shape of my hands. This has given me certain advantages. I have been able to focus my energy on other things, on learning, on service, on the accumulation of power and influence. I have been able to form friendships and alliances without the complications that sexual desire might bring. I have been able to serve in positions of trust where an intact man might not be trusted. But it has also meant that I have never experienced one of the fundamental aspects of human existence. I have never known the deep satisfaction of physical love, the comfort of intimate partnership, the joy of creating new life. I have been, in a sense, only partially human. This is what you must understand about the choice you are making. When you choose celibacy, you are not simply giving up a pleasure, you are choosing to close off one of the primary ways that human beings connect with each other and with the creative force of existence. This may be the right choice for you, but it is not a choice to be made lightly. I have watched many men over the years, and I have seen that those who are happiest in their celibacy are those who have found a way to channel their sexual energy into something else, into spiritual practice, into creative work, into service to others. They do not simply suppress their desires. They transform them. The Christian monks I have known seem to understand this. They speak of their love for God in terms that are sometimes explicitly sexual, as though they have redirected their capacity for physical love toward a spiritual object. They speak of being brides of Christ, of experiencing spiritual ecstasy, of finding in their relationship with God a satisfaction that rivals or exceeds what they might have found in human relationships. I think this transformation is possible, but I also think it requires a level of spiritual development that not everyone can achieve. And I think it requires a clear understanding of what is being given up. You have asked for my blessing, and I will give it, but with this understanding that you are choosing a path that will close off certain possibilities while opening others. You will never know the simple pleasure of a wife's embrace, the joy of holding your own child, the comfort of growing old with someone who has shared your life. But you may find something else, a deeper connection with the divine, a freedom to serve others without the constraints of family obligation, a kind of spiritual fulfillment that is not available to those who are caught up in the complexities of sexual and romantic life. Whether this trade is worthwhile depends on your own nature and your own spiritual calling. I cannot make that judgment for you, but I can tell you that celibacy, whether chosen or imposed, is not simply an absence. It is a presence, a way of being in the world that has its own challenges and its own rewards. I have lived my entire adult life in this state, and I have found it to be both a limitation and a liberation. It has cut me off from certain experiences, but it has also given me access to others. It has made me, in some ways, less than fully human, but it has also given me a perspective on human nature that I might not have had otherwise. If you choose this path, you will face challenges that I have never faced, because your celibacy will be a discipline rather than a condition. You will have to resist temptations that I have never felt, maintain boundaries that I have never had to maintain, but you will also have the satisfaction of knowing that your choice is truly your own, that your service to God comes from your own will rather than from external compulsion. This is both the burden and the blessing of chosen celibacy. It is harder than imposed celibacy in some ways, because it requires constant vigilance and constant recommitment. But it is also more meaningful, because it represents a genuine sacrifice rather than simply an acceptance of what has been imposed. As Hazen finishes writing his letter, he reflects on the strange ironies of his position. He has spent his entire adult life in a state of celibacy, yet he has never faced the spiritual challenges that celibacy presents to those who choose it freely. He has been freed from sexual desire, but he has also been freed from the spiritual discipline that comes from consciously renouncing it. In some ways, he envies his nephew the choice he is making. To choose celibacy, to consciously renounce sexuality for the sake of spiritual development, requires a kind of courage and commitment that Hazen has never had to summon. His own celibacy has been, in a sense, the easy path not chosen, and therefore not requiring the constant effort of choice. But he also recognizes that his own experience has given him insights that might be valuable to those who are choosing celibacy freely. He has lived for decades without sexual desire, and he has seen how this absence shapes a life. He has observed the ways that sexual energy can be channeled into other pursuits, and he has seen the costs and benefits of such channeling. Most importantly, he has learned that celibacy is not simply a negative state, the absence of sexuality, but a positive condition that creates its own possibilities and constraints. It is a way of being in the world It has its own integrity, its own challenges, and its own rewards. As he seals the letter and prepares to send it to his nephew, Hazen reflects on the strange community of celibate men that exists across religious and cultural boundaries. Christian monks, Buddhist monks, Islamic Sufis, and Ottoman eunuchs, all of them have chosen or been forced into lives without sexual expression, and all of them have found ways to make meaning from this condition. The methods are different, the motivations are different, but the underlying challenge is the same. How to live a fully human life while renouncing one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience. It is a challenge that has no easy answers, but it is also a challenge that has produced some of the most profound spiritual insights in human history. In the end, Hazen thinks celibacy is not about the absence of desire, but about the transformation of desire. Whether chosen or imposed, it forces the individual to find new ways of connecting with others and with the divine, new ways of channeling the creative energy that sexuality represents. It is a path that few can walk successfully, but for those who can, it offers possibilities that are not available to those who follow the more conventional paths of human relationship. The call to prayer ends, and the palace settles into the quiet of afternoon. Hazen sits for a moment longer, thinking about his nephew, about the choice he is making, about the strange journey that has brought them both to this moment. Then he rises, places the letter in the hands of a trusted messenger, and returns to his duties. The treasury awaits, and with it, the practical demands of a life lived in service to earthly power. But for a moment, he has touched something deeper, something that connects him to all those who have chosen to live without sexual love in search of something greater. Conclusion. The sun has set now, wherever you are listening to this story. We have traveled together through centuries and continents, through the private struggles of individuals who chose or were forced to live without the consolations of romantic love. We have sat with Brother Thomas in his cold monastery, walked with Hypatia through the streets of ancient Alexandria, meditated with Ananda in his mountain cave, and read the thoughtful letter of Hazanaga in his palace chamber. Each of these stories is different, yet they share something profound. They all speak to the human capacity to transform limitation into meaning, to find purpose in renunciation, to discover depths of experience that might otherwise remain hidden. They remind us that celibacy, whether chosen or imposed, is not simply an absence, but a presence, a way of being in the world that creates its own possibilities and challenges. Brother Thomas found in his daily rhythm of prayer and copying a kind of peace that was not the absence of longing, but the presence of something greater. Hypatia discovered that her chastity could be a form of power, a way of claiming ownership over her own life and mind, even as it ultimately made her vulnerable to those who could not tolerate such independence. Ananda learned that desire could be transformed rather than simply suppressed, that the very energy that might bind him to suffering could become a tool for liberation. And Hasan Aga, whose celibacy was imposed rather than chosen, found in his condition a unique perspective on the nature of human desire and the possibilities of spiritual transformation. These are not simple stories of success or failure, of good choices or bad ones. They are stories of human beings grappling with one of the most fundamental aspects of existence, the tension between what we want and what we choose, between the demands of the body and the aspirations of the spirit, between the desire for connection and the call to transcendence. In our own time, when the conversation about sexuality and spirituality has become so polarized, these historical voices offer a different perspective. They remind us that the relationship between celibacy and spiritual development is complex, that there are many ways to live a meaningful life, and that the choices we make about desire and renunciation are deeply personal and should be respected, whether they lead us toward or away from conventional expressions of love. Perhaps most importantly, these stories remind us that the human capacity for growth and transformation is remarkable. Each of these individuals found ways to create meaning and purpose within the constraints they faced. whether those constraints were chosen or imposed. They discovered that limitations can become doorways, that what appears to be loss can become gain, that the path to fulfillment is not always the path we might expect. As you settle into sleep tonight, let these stories rest gently in your mind. Let them remind you that the human experience is vast and varied, that there are many ways to live a life of meaning and purpose, and that the choices that seem most difficult often lead to the most profound discoveries. The bells that called Brother Thomas to prayer have long since fallen silent, but their echo continues in the choices we make about how to live with our own desires and limitations. The library where Hypatia taught has crumbled to dust, but her example of intellectual courage and independence continues to inspire. The monastery where Ananda learned to transform desire into wisdom has vanished, but his insights live on in the continuing Buddhist tradition. The palace where Hasan Aga served has become a museum, but his thoughtful reflections on the nature of chosen versus imposed celibacy continue to offer wisdom to those who grapple with similar questions. In the end, these are not just stories about celibacy. They are stories about the human capacity to find meaning in any circumstances, to transform limitation into liberation, to discover that what we thought we needed for happiness might not be what we need at all. They remind us that the path to fulfillment is not always the path we expect, and that sometimes the greatest discoveries come from the places we thought we could never go. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet wisdom of those who have walked before us, who have faced their own challenges and limitations, and who have found in those very challenges the seeds of transformation and growth.